Dedicated to my wife, Romare Bearden. Romare Bearden was born into a middle-class family and never suffered real poverty. He was raised in the North and did not have to contend with the segregation of the South in the first half of this century. He became the most celebrated black American artist of the 20th century. But because he was black, he had to struggle for much of his career to get his work shown. And throughout his career, he had to struggle against being labeled a black artist. Following Bearden's death in 1988, a writer named Amy Wallach published a newspaper article in appreciation of his work and career. Instead of recognizing the sheer technicolor brilliance of his work, critics confined him to an artistic ghetto, wrote Wallach. America's greatest black artist is what they called him. It meant that his art, unlike that of most black artists, got looked at, but it wasn't always seen for what it was. White people who saw that his subject matter was often black people appreciated his forms and colors, but didn't think that his vision of life could have anything to do with them. Bearden spent his whole career trying to create a vision of life that went past race. He never succeeded in getting most people to see it. Romare Bearden was born in Charlotte, North Carolina on September 2, 1912. Charlotte was where Romare's family came from. Romare's parents, Howard and Bessie Bearden, actually lived in New York, in Harlem, where Howard worked for the city of New York as a sanitation inspector, and Bessie was New York editor of a black weekly newspaper, the Chicago Defender. The name they gave their only child, Romare, is pronounced Romare, and is a West Indian name, for both parents were of West Indian heritage. Romare grew up in Harlem. At that time, Harlem was just beginning to be a black neighborhood. Romare and his family lived on the third floor of an apartment building on 154 West and 131st Street. With both parents working and only one child, the family lived comfortably. Romare went to public school on 139th at 140th Street and Lenox Avenue, in the heart of Harlem. His classmates were a mixture of blacks and white immigrants, mostly Italian and Irish, whose blocks of Harlem were Italian or Irish or African American, and there was not much mingling outside of school. In fact, black kids stayed away from the white blocks and vice versa. Romare was sometimes at a disadvantage because he was so light-complected as to be taken for white. He ran the risk of being beaten up by the white kids because he was a Negro, and of being beaten up by the black kids he didn't know because they thought he was white. Except for having to worry about the gangs and their turf wars, life in Harlem was exciting for a young boy. Bearden remembered that the sound of jazz was all around. Not only was it on the radio and record players, but I often heard sounds of a piano from an open window, and in warm weather there were likely to be 2 or 3 musicians on a street corner playing for whatever onlookers might drop in the hat. J. Rosamond Johnson lived in the same apartment house as my parents. Among the many, many compositions he wrote with his brother James Weldon is Lift Every Voice and Sing, which became the Negro national anthem. Romare's father was musical and as a young man had been the organist in his church in Charlotte, North Carolina. In Harlem, he made friends with many great musicians. The composer and orchestra leader, Duke Ellington, was one of them. From time to time, Romare thought of composing songs, but he was not very serious about it. When Romare was small, he spent his summers in North Carolina with his father's relatives. When he was around 10, he began visiting his mother's people in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, each summer. His grandmother lived near the steel mills and ran a boarding house for the black men who came from the South to work in the mills. The men could make $40 to $50 a week, far more than they could make at any job in the South. But working around the hot furnaces was hard. Romare remembered his grandmother rubbing down the men's bodies with cocoa butter because they would be scorched from the flames of the furnaces. The summer he was 12, Romare met the person who introduced him to art. The boy's name was Eugene, and he wore leg braces, having suffered from infantile paralysis. He could not run and play with the other boys, but he could draw beautifully. Romare asked Eugene to teach him. Romare's grandmother set up a table in his room, and every day he and Eugene would draw. All of Eugene's drawings were of the local house of prostitution, which was called Sadie's. And when Romare's grandmother saw the drawings, she took them away. After she learned that Eugene's mother worked at Sadie's, she insisted that Eugene come to live with them. His mother seemed pleased with the idea and visited on Sundays. Eugene stopped drawing after he went to live with Romare's grandmother. He was sickly and died about a year later. 13-year-old Romare was a pallbearer at his funeral. Romare attended 1 year of high school in Harlem, but after that he decided he would rather be with his friends in Pittsburgh. His parents had no objection, and he lived with his grandmother while attending Peabody High School. He graduated in 1929, the year the New York Stock Exchange market crashed. The Great Depression soon followed, but it did not really affect Romare's family. His father did not lose his job. His mother had, by this time, become a community leader, the first woman appointed to a school board in New York City, and chairwoman of the local school board. She was also national treasurer of the Council of Negro Women and a member of the executive board of the New York Urban League. Money to send Romare to college, and there was no question that he would go. His parents wanted him to be a doctor. Romare first enrolled at Boston University. There he devoted most attention to baseball than he did to his studies. He was the star pitcher on the varsity team. During the summers, he pitched for the Boston Tigers, a Negro team that often played exhibition games with semi-pro clubs. In those days, there were no blacks in Major League Baseball, but because he was so light-skinned, Romare was told that if he wanted to, he could pass for white and join a Major League team, but he did not want to do that. At the urging of his parents, after 2 years in Boston, Romare transferred to New York University. There he settled down to his studies and majored in mathematics with the idea of going on to medical school. He also started drawing for the college humor magazine. From time to time in the years after Eugene's death, Bearden had sat down to draw, but he hadn't devoted much time to it while he was playing baseball. Now he started getting interested in it again. He met E. Sims Campbell, a very successful black cartoonist, who saw talent in his work and encouraged him to pursue it. Soon Bearden was contributing a weekly political cartoon to the Afro-American, a nationally circulated black newspaper based in Baltimore, Maryland. By the time Bearden graduated from New York University in 1935 with his degree in mathematics, he had given up the idea of being a doctor. His mother, especially, did not want him to be an artist. She told him that there were very few black artists, that he would be hard-pressed to make a living from his art. The same year Bearden graduated from New York University, his mother got a job as deputy collector for the 3rd New York Internal Revenue District. She firmly believed that a person should either have a government job, as she and her husband did, or become a professional, such as a doctor. Bearden was determined to do what he wanted. That same year, he attended a meeting of artists at the Harlem YMCA on 135th Street and was delighted to see some 40 to 50 people there. There were obviously more black artists around than his mother thought. Some of them formed the Harlem Artists Guild, and Bearden found the guild to be an important source of moral support, not to mention artistic influence. By this time, the Great Depression had plunged the nation into hardship, and the federal government under President Franklin Roosevelt was trying to provide jobs in a variety of fields. These included art, writing, and theater. The Works Progress Administration set up programs to pay writers and other artists to create works for the people, and many of Bearden's artist friends worked for the WPA. Unfortunately for Bearden, his parents made too much money for him to be eligible. 1936, he enrolled at the Art Students League in downtown Manhattan. There he planned to pursue drawing, especially the drawing of political cartoons. But his teacher, George Grosz, who had left Germany to come to the United States, persuaded him to study realistic drawing and composition. Under Grosz, Bearden discovered the great Dutch painters as well as German and French artists. But he left the Art Students League after about a year and a half. He was anxious to be on his own and not to be dependent on his parents. He got a job as a caseworker with the New York City Department of Welfare, and as soon as he saved up enough money, he moved into a studio apartment at 33 West and 125th Street. The painter Jacob Lawrence had a studio on the floor below him, and soon a young poet named Claude McKay also moved into the building. It was a wonderful time to be young and creative in Harlem. There was a great interchange of people coming to Harlem from all over, Bearden recalled. You got to know all kinds of people, actors, musicians, underworld characters, intellectuals, society types. There was always a lot of movement from place to place, and it was so easy to know people. Through his friends, Bearden learned about art and all the different forms it could take. He went to his first exhibition of African art at the Museum of Modern Art, and what he saw gave him a great sense of pride in being black. But Bearden was having difficulty deciding what to paint. At that time he was painting on brown paper, and he had a piece on his easel. But week after week he put nothing on the paper. One day the woman who cleaned for him once a week asked him if he wasn't supposed to be an artist. When he told her he was trying to decide what to paint, she suggested that he paint her. He looked at her. She said, "I know I'm homely, but when you can look at me and find what is beautiful, then you're going to be able to put something down on that piece of paper." He thought about what she said, and while he never did paint her, he did begin to paint. He started thinking about the summers he had spent as a child in Charlotte and painted pictures of his memories. He painted in bright colors and in very stylized form. He didn't try to make the pictures look realistic, as most of his artist friends were doing. He exhibited several of his paintings at shows in Harlem and one in Downtown Gallery in 1940 and 1941. In 1941, the United States entered World War II, and the following year, Bearden went into the Army. The armed service were segregated in those days, and he served in the 372nd Infantry, a Negro regiment. He was stationed at various bases in the United States before being discharged in 1945 with the rank of sergeant. Back in New York, Bearden moved into a studio west on 125th Street, next door to the famous Apollo Theater, where all the major black entertainers performed. But he found that Harlem had changed. There had been riots in 1943, and people were no longer as friendly. Many of his artist friends had moved away, and the Harlem Artist Guild was no longer active. The more somber mood of Harlem seemed to fit the way Romare Bearden was feeling. His mother had died in 1943, and it took him a long time to get over the loss. He now made paintings using much less color, and his figures were more realistic. He painted mostly religious subjects. He had several shows, but he still could not make a living as an artist. In 1946, Bearden went back to work for the Department of Welfare. He painted at night. He still did not feel as if he had found the kinds of paintings he wanted to do, and worried that he had not had enough training. In 1949, he decided to go to Paris, where most of his artist friends had visited. He took a leave of absence from his job. In Paris, Bearden met the black American writer James Baldwin and Richard Wright. He also met the artists Picasso, Braque, and Brancusi. He did a lot of sightseeing, but no painting. Instead, he soaked up ideas. He loved the city and applied for a scholarship to study there, but he did not get it and had to return to New York. He went back to his job with the Department of Welfare and tried to figure out how he was going to save money he needed to go back to Paris. He couldn't seem to make much of anything from his painting, so he decided to write songs instead. A couple of his friends in the music business helped him, and before long he was writing song after song. In 2 years he had about 20 songs recorded, and one of them, Sea Breeze, was a big hit recorded by several popular singers. But Bearden didn't really want to be a songwriter. He wanted to be a painter. He was so unhappy that it began to affect him physically. He was sure he had some terrible disease and at one point went to the hospital. The doctors could find nothing physically wrong with him. The problem was in his mind. He was suffering from the pressure of doing what he didn't want to do and not doing what he did want to do. As one doctor told him, "You blew a fuse." At that time, Romare Bearden met Nanette Rohan at a party in Harlem. She was from Staten Island, New York, but her parents were from the West Indies. They fell in love and married soon afterward, and Bearden always credited Nanette Rohan with bringing him out of his unhappiness. Soon he was painting again. But he still felt that he lacked training. He could not afford to go to Paris. So he started teaching himself by copying the great paintings of history. He would take a black and white photograph of a painting, have it blown up large, and then copy it, using his own color ideas. He became so interested in colors that when he did own his paintings, he painted in an abstract style, not concentrating on figures at all. In 1956, Romare and Nanette Bearden moved out of Harlem and into a loft on Canal Street. A year or so after that, he met a Chinese man named Mr. Wu, who was an expert in Chinese art and calligraphy. With Mr. Wu's help, he began studying Chinese landscape paintings and learning that the spaces between shapes and colors can be as important as the shapes and colors themselves. He started painting on rice paper, gluing it to the canvas, and then tearing away sections. Bearden was producing some wonderful work, but he found it very hard to find galleries interested in showing it. Even so, he was much better off than many other black artists who couldn't get their work shown at all. More and more galleries were opening up in New York, and Bearden and his friends could not understand why there wasn't more interest in their work. By this time in the early 1960s, the civil rights movement was in full swing. Blacks in the South were demanding the right to vote and to use public facilities equally with rights. Northern blacks like Bearden and his friends began to think about how discrimination could take on many forms. In their case, they believed that black artists were discriminated against in the art world. White gallery owners and museum curators refused to look at their work purely as art. Rather, they saw it as art by blacks and dismissed it. In 1963, a group of artists met in Bearden's loft and found the Spiral Group, choosing that name because it meant to move up and out. They rented a room nearby where they met once a week and where they planned to put on exhibitions. In one meeting, someone suggested that they work together on a painting. Bearden started thinking about how this would work since they all had very different styles. Then it occurred to him that they could work together on a collage. A collage is a combination of fragments, at least some of which are pasted on canvas or paper. It can be a combination of paper and paint, or of paper, paint, and objects. Bearden decided to use pictures from magazines. He cut out a number of pictures and took them to the next meeting of the Spiral Group. But nobody else seemed very interested in his idea. Still, he was interested enough to start working with the pictures. He pasted them on typewriter paper and then added watercolor paint and drawings. For his subjects, he called upon his many experiences and the many images that had impressed him. Jazz music, African art, scenes from the South, Chinese landscapes, faces of people in Harlem. A friend suggested that he have them photographed and the photos blown up large. Bearden wasn't especially impressed with the result, but a gallery owner named Arnie Ekstrom was. Bearden and Ekstrom decided to call the works projections, and that was the name of the Bearden show that opened at the Cordier and Ekstrom Gallery in the fall of 1964. The show was a great success and brought Bearden the most publicity he had ever enjoyed. He and his works were the subject of articles and mentions in Time and Newsweek magazines and in the New York Times, as well as in many art magazines. Wrote the reviewer in Pictures on Exhibit, "Only a painter of rare sensitivity to tone and form could have worked out this pattern so eloquently, and only a deep sentient person could have absorbed into his own emotional reservoir this travail of a whole people." But Bearden was still not satisfied. He believed that photographs of his work removed it too far from the viewer. So he started gluing his photographs first to canvas, which warped, and then to wood, which did not warp. He worked with colors. The results were so successful that by 1966, he was finally making enough money as an artist to quit his job at the Department of Welfare. Over the next 20 years, Romare Bearden became a celebrated artist. Major museums bought his collages, and in 1971, the Museum of Modern Art in New York put on a whole show of his works from the beginning of his career. But like lesser-known artists who happened to be black, he never managed to achieve celebrity as an American artist without reference to his race. He was always called a black artist. True, Bearden's themes were mainly about black life, but that was because he worked with subjects he knew best. His desire to transcend or go beyond his subject matter and offer a vision of human life. But critics, gallery owners, museum directors, and private collectors could understand that. Most living black artists were nearly unknown, and it was much harder for a young black artist to find a gallery willing to show his work than it was for a young white artist. So in 1969, Bearden and two other artists opened the Cinque Gallery to show the work of young black artists. Named after Joseph Cinque, the African prince who led a successful revolt aboard a slave ship in 1839. The gallery later showed the work of older black artists and other minority artists who could not get shows at other galleries. Romare Bearden also spent a great deal of time encouraging and helping young black artists on an informal basis. His telephone rang all the time, and he was happy to give advice whenever he could, even though he often had to interrupt his own work to do so. He continued to work almost entirely in collage. No longer did he feel the need to try one form after another in order to find what he could do best. But within the collage form, he continued to experiment, always looking for a new way to place colors and shapes to offer his new vision of life. Over the years, he completely replaced the magazine and newspaper cutouts he had been using with bits of cut up and repainted colored paper. Bearden's designs became more sophisticated, his colors richer and purer. One thing he did not change was his subject matter. He continued to take from his own experiences, and that meant from black life. He also continued to feel and to say that there was no such thing as black art, just as there was no such thing as white art. In 1946, he wrote, "The true artist feels that there is only one art, and that it belongs to all mankind." 40 years later, he still felt that way. The last 10 years of his life, Romare Bearden branched out into different types of art. He designed sets from the Alvin Ailey Dance Company and drew a backdrop for a Hollywood movie. The city of Baltimore asked him to design a mosaic mural for one of its subway stations. He illustrated a children's book entitled A Trip to the Country. In 1988, Romare Bearden was given the National Medal of Arts by President Ronald Reagan. It was just one of many honors he received in his older years. Bearden died of bone cancer in March 1980 at the age of 75. In his will, he directed that some of the money in his estate be used to set up the Romare Bearden Foundation to aid, encourage, and foster the education and training of deserving and talented young artists. The end.